Chernobyl. This name will forever spark a remembrance in the world after the date of April 26, 1986. A day marked by lives lost too soon, a day that sparked a silent killer that spread across the continent of Europe within a matter of hours. The nuclear meltdown of Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl power plant in Pripyat, Ukraine is one no one saw coming. Workers at the plant were conducting a routine checkup as instructed. One pressed the button that was supposed to settle the reactor and decrease heat levels, but it ended up doing quite the opposite. According to History.com, two massive explosions blew the 1,000-ton roof off of one of the plant's reactors, releasing 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb dropped in Hiroshima. Two were killed instantly in the explosion, and in the months that followed, around 28 more people would die due to acute radiation syndrome. Within the year, thousands more in the Soviet Union and beyond would show signs of extreme radiation exposure. When the disaster happened, it was not met with the appropriate level of concern. Power plant officials and Soviet politicians worked harder to protect their own reputations than to confront the actual disaster and the quickly escalating dangers. The Soviet Union was afraid to suffer wounded pride despite the quickly escalating situation. Gorbachev, then Soviet president, remembers when he first received news of Chernobyl and he, quote, saw no need to awaken other members of the Soviet leadership or interrupt the weekend by calling an emergency session of the Politburo. Instead, Gorbachev approved the creation of a state commission to look into the causes of the explosion and deal with its consequences, end quote, states History.com. Nobody was leading the response prior to the commission because nobody dared to label the reactor dead with an exposed core, and none stepped up to take responsibility. The Soviet Union and all the individuals involved were withholding information for fear of wounded pride and individual consequences. Valery Legasov, a highly renowned nuclear scientist, was brought into the situation as chief of this commission. Many recognize him as the sole logical figure representing the Chernobyl case, as he had a transparency with the public that was most certainly not favored by Gorbachev or the KGB. When it was discovered how much radiation was being emitted into the atmosphere due to the exposed core, officials began arriving and scientists began taking action at the problem at hand. Scientists based their guesses about what happened on the state the reactor appeared to be in. Nobody could get anywhere close without being exposed to fatal amounts of radiation. When investigators finally were able to get information out of the two workers running the test, they both repeated the same name, a name that would further be tainted by this disaster: Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer of the Chernobyl power plant. There's disagreement regarding Dyatlov's part in the disaster, nevertheless, the blame still fell to him. The safety of the citizens in the town of Pripyat was another major problem. The town was founded to accommodate the families of the power plant workers. With the reactor meltdown, they were directly exposed to high levels of radiation. History.com states, life went on as usual for about a day in the neighboring town of Pripyat. Aside from the sight of trucks cleaning the streets with foam, there were initially few signs of the disaster unfolding just miles away. It wasn't until the next day, April 27th, when the government began evacuations of Pripyat's 50,000 residents. Residents were told they would be away for just a few days, so they took very little with them. Most would never return to their homes. Of course, the Soviet Union couldn't keep this nuclear meltdown a secret forever. It took days for Soviet leadership to inform the international community that the disaster had occurred. The government made no official statement about the global-scale accident until, on the morning of April 28th, 2 days after the disaster, Swedish leaders demanded an explanation when operators of a nuclear power plant in Stockholm registered unusually high radiation levels near their plant. The Union was put on the spotlight. Even after officials acknowledged that there had been an accident at the Chernobyl power plant, many citizens in Ukraine were unaware of the rushed evacuation of Pripyat and deaths by acute radiation syndrome. Although citizens living a number of miles away from the largest nuclear disaster in history were unaware of how serious the situation was, the United States had exclusive knowledge of the disaster within just 4 days, including equipment involved, radiation levels, and the difficulty putting out the fires. President Ronald Reagan used this to his advantage in every way he could. With the promise of aid to the Soviet government, the pressure was on Gorbachev to continue to support glasnost by becoming more open with communications to the West. The Chernobyl disaster, the worst nuclear disaster in history, forced change upon the Soviet government as it was not possible to disguise the damage, states CHMU. The US was tracking the cloud of radiation which was being dispersed across the continent of Europe and assured American citizens The Environmental Protection Agency, which maintains the nation's radiation monitoring network, has increased its sampling frequency to a daily basis for airborne radioactivity. The United States government determined it was a low possibility that any radiation would make it over, and if it did, it would pose little threat to the public. Nevertheless, Reagan still assembled a small task force to monitor the situation at hand. All of the cleanup and evacuation ended up costing the Soviet Union billions. Mikhail Gorbachev said he later believed the fall of the Union could have been Chernobyl. Even more than my launch of perestroika was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union 5 years later, he recalls. The world was dealing with a crisis that had never been dealt before, surrounding a topic that had already been controversial and was constantly being debated. A disaster where the explosions released 400 times more radioactive fallout as the bomb the US had dropped in Hiroshima in 1945, according to Business Insider. The incident forever changed how many viewed nuclear power. Almost without exception, national nuclear energy programs have been subjected to increased public and scientific scrutiny. This attention generally has reinforced the public's reservations about the safety of nuclear power and, in a number of instances, has led to the contraction or outright cancellation of certain nuclear power programs, said Science Direct. Following Chernobyl, people became much more proactive with their opinions on nuclear power and putting the effort to educate themselves on the topic. And while there were many views on how Chernobyl meltdown could have been handled, there was one major point of overlap. We were too unprepared. Nuclear energy has been controversial since the 60s. Unlike the burning of fossil fuels, it releases no gas or carbon emissions, but it does produce deadly nuclear waste that needs to be disposed of or kept in a place that is likely to never leave. Before the Chernobyl disaster, most people were seeing it as a revolution in the technology industry. In the 70s, the people were becoming more opinionated as more research was released. After 3 Mile Island, a partial reactor meltdown on American soil in 1979, the most significant accident regarding nuclear power in the US to date, concerns and skepticism about nuclear energy were further increased. 2 international agreements were crafted as a direct result of Chernobyl: the Convention on Assistance in Case of a Nuclear Accident or Radiological Emergency, and the Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident. The extreme outcomes of Chernobyl disaster were caused by the level of unpreparedness and putting political reputation before science, and these agreements were crafted to put systems into place to avoid future scenarios. According to GreenFacts, the agricultural sector of the economy is the area that was worst hit by the Chernobyl accident. GreenFacts also notes, Chernobyl spread radiation into the air, land, water, and livestock, making the land unlivable. The exposure of radiation is still present in many of the necessary resources. Many of the trees had a physical half-life, meaning that their lifespan was half of what a normal tree would have lived. Smithsonian also wrote that a study found that the half-life of the radiation in trees is around 2 years, meaning that every 2 years the concentration of radiation would drop by half. After the trees died and the radioactive iodine was still in the soil, radioactive iodine was spread into farmlands and grazing pastures for livestock, so whatever milk or meat was produced was affected for 2 months. Some of the closed bodies of water, such as lakes and ponds, still have high levels of radiation and will for decades. This, in turn, affects anything living in the water or other connected ecosystems. Overall, the radiation spread throughout the continent of Europe due to the reactor force meltdown at Chernobyl was more extensive than any atomic event in history. This disaster was caused by a chain reaction that started with lack of communication and a power complex where science and politics were dangerously intertwined. Chernobyl will be remembered as a dark day in history and one that will forever shape the nuclear power industry.